All right. I am now joined by C Derick Varn,
Nice.
who is a teacher and a poet, but somebody I know from Zero Books,
Yep.
and from spending a lot of time arguing about Marx and stuff. So, how are you doing?
Yep. I'm doing well. We've been arguing now for almost a decade.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. So, outstanding. Well, let's. I would say let's get into it, but actually, before we do that, I thought it might be fun. You actually just did a video, which I liked a lot, for Zero Books, about tough-mindedness. You want to riff on that for a minute? You know what you mean by that, and why? Yeah.
So I actually take that phrase from the psychological literature. So I specifically mean analytical tough-mindedness, our willingness to entertain ideas that threaten your self-conception, ideological conception, etc. So it's a way of dealing with alternate hypothesis, null hypothesis, divergent information that I think people really need to train themselves in how to do. And it's not something anyone does naturally. So that's one of the reasons why I decided when Doug was like, well, why don't you do something on the basics of critical theory? And I was like, we need to start from a square before even that. We got to start from like how to approach things without bringing in your prior hopes, dreams, and biases as, just totally post hoc arguments. And anyone who's ever argued on the internet, which Ben, you do even more than me, you almost do it professionally at this point.
Yeah. and was doing lots and lots of it long before I was doing it professionally.
Right. You know that most people's understandings, of logic are really, even when they're logically sound, is usually pretty self-motivated. And I think the first thing you have to train yourself if you're going into not just argumentation, but particularly critical theory, because critical theory, there's all kinds of mystification games you can do. And you can basically make yourself unattackable, but also completely wrong, like all the time. And so when we were thinking about this show, I was like, okay, so theorizing with a hammer, and the first thing you have to deal with is your own self-orientation. And so it's, in this case, I wasn't just dealing with logic, I'm also dealing with terror management theory, I'm dealing with some elements of critical theory, and then basic motivated reasoning, and stuff that people have been talking about going all the way back to Hume.
Right. Yeah. So actually, when you say critical theory, because despite having written a couple of books at this point for a critical theory imprint, something that calls itself that, and I think having some idea of what you mean by that, what Doug means by that. I also, this is, I think, probably where my own academic biases come in, right? That I sort of vaguely associate it with something that it means in certain kinds of academic settings that, isn't necessarily, this sort of way of thinking and arguing about things that I'm most used to. And I think maybe what you mean by it overlaps with the more specific academic meaning, but is also a little bit different. So do you want to just start there?
Yeah, so critical theory, and my conception, is actually taking some of the heuristics that you get out of Marxism, out of sociology, combining them, hopefully, knock on desk, with different forms of logical argumentation, different modes of reasoning, and using it, doubly as a way to change the way we think about the world, other than change what we do with the world. And that's super broad. That's a whole, I'm, taking the end of the thesis on Feuerbach and but there's a bunch of issues with critical theory as it's developed, and we know it. You and I actually are not unique, but are different in that we both have analytical and critical theoretical training. You were in an MFA program. I was in an MFA program. I believe we were both in an MFA program at the time when high post-structuralist theory was like the sexiest thing ever. And
Right.
like Zizek and Lacan were like a way that you fought against it, although Lacan himself was also associated with high pro-structuralism. So you're just like, ah.
Yeah.
And we were also from classically trained, like, I didn't study, actually. I wasn't in an analytic philosophy department. My philosophy department was more historical, but I was trained in like formal logics. I understood, like, one of my first readings in philosophy that I took very seriously was not, Marx or even Nietzsche, which was the other big guy, but it was Derek Parfit. So like, so I understand.
Which I should say, by the way, that I never actually met Derek Parfit. He died a few years ago, but I was an adjunct at Rutgers, where he taught part of the year, and I was friends. I think I can say this now, without getting anybody in trouble, right? I was friends with a graduate student there who was one of his housemates. So I think I had. I'm pretty sure that like I sat there like, drinking whiskey with this guy, like a few yards away from where Parfit was, was sleeping, a few times, but but he died early enough after when I got there that that I never met him. But I'm actually a huge fan. Like I think that as far as like combining like that kind of analytical rigor that you're talking about with clarity, right? With being very clear, and also with like having a knack for like taking these really esoteric subjects and sort of zeroing in on why a human being would actually give a shit about them, right? Like I think whatever you think about his his conclusions, some of which I like, some of which I don't. I think Parfit's a writer that that I often wish. In fact, I've actually often had the thought. I don't want to get you too off track here, but I've often had the thought that like when I like argue with argue with people on socialist Twitter or whatever about politics, I often have the thought that I wish people would read more Parfit, because he's so eloquent about like the difference between like arguing about reality and arguing about the labels that we use to apply reality to reality. And I think that's a confusion that like constantly crops up there. But anyway, you're talking about your background with all this.
Yeah. So, oh man, you're getting into like object symbolization subject problems, which is, actually I've been thinking a lot about, and this is a particularly Marxist problem in some ways. I think sometimes we are allergic to dealing with symbolic, and I think part of that's an equivocation, like symbolic mediation, to be specific. Some of that's an equivocation because symbolic concessions by liberals and capital, and then we hear symbolism and freak out. And part of that is, I think it threatens our base superstructure metaphors, which I hate to tell people is a metaphor. Like it's a model metaphor. You can't actually like prove it. It's not a scientific hypothesis in that sense. It is only a model. If Marx thought differently, then whatever. But
I'd also point out actually that like something that I think introduces a lot of confusion to this is that Marx, and then especially maybe Engels, really like to throw around the word science a lot. But like, I think in the 19th century in general, and for them in particular, like I think that word had a much like broader, or at least slightly different meaning, than I think we would associate it with it now.
Well, one, in English it even did, but two, the German word in specific is a little broader because it can also refer to math and just formal logics in general.
Right.
And there is a certain kind of like philological, like, let's save Marx by finding this obscure reading of this one word and like not make him deal with this sort of way that people will do, or people do that with Hegel even more.
Yeah.
But there's some truth to the fact that they don't mean by science, they don't mean by a lot of things actually what we mean by them. Like, I think when they read about, say, intellectia and Lenin, they think of like modern professors. But then I had to, like I was explaining to someone, the structure of the university was actually quite different, and they weren't really wage earners. They were paid either either like by stipend by the state directly and only that, or they were paid by their students per lecture in a lot of cases. Like, so, I mean, this also creates some issues that like Marx doesn't deal with. You know, Marx doesn't deal with skills rents at all, or very rarely. I don't find any discussion of it in the philosophical manuscripts. I've looked and in the philosophical and economic manuscripts, you know, it's not in the Gradessa much. It doesn't really come up in Capital Volume 3. I haven't seen it in Theories of Surplus Value. So like that's, you know, there is stuff that Marxists just don't want to deal with because it's not in Marx. And we're used to, I think this is partly worse now because of the internet, but I also think it's partly because of the historical nature of where most of us came out of in relations to states in the Cold War. We are used to arguing off the authority of text as opposed to trying to validate or invalidate those texts with empirical observations that can be plugged into the theories or not.
Yeah.
And that's really hurt the Marxist, you know, I'm going to use a Lakatosian phrase, like the research program of Marxism. And I realize that Marxism is really not a research program. It's kind of a conglomeration into a political program. But like when we don't even agree on what the terms we're using mean half the time, it's a huge problem.
No, for sure. Right. Like, I think, yeah, I mean, I guess my background with some of this stuff is a little bit different, but there's a lot of overlap. Like you said, we both went to MFA programs, and in mine, you know, I guess I was exposed to at least enough of the post-structuralist stuff to, you know, to sort of roll my eyes at it and, you know, pass in you know, like Zizek, I guess for me was always mostly like somebody I thought of as entertaining and insightful, like cultural critic, but and political commentator. I was talking to Russ Sabrigli about him a couple days ago on here, and you know, like a lot of the stuff about Lacan, you know, I just couldn't tell you, right? I have no, you know, I have no opinion about a lot of that since I just don't know enough. But yeah, I did, you know, go to graduate school in you know, analytic philosophy and do like really esoteric stuff in there about logical paradoxes. But like before that, right? Like, I mean, like I was interested in the Marxist stuff like long before that, right? I mean, I was a teenage Trotskyist. And you know, that was, you know, I mean, and then like, I think, if anything, I think it's been like a much more recent project for me to sort of try to put the two threads together and to try to apply some of the analytic philosophy training to, you know, I mean, obviously this is not at all novel, you know, that, you know, A. Cohen, who somebody was asking about it in the chat, right, is probably the biggest, you know, exemplar of this. But to try to apply that to say, okay, you know, I think, you know, I think this guy is right about a lot of stuff, right? This guy being Karl Marx here, right? Like, I think he's right about a lot of stuff. This is, you know, like I've, you know, certainly, you know, the way I think about socialist politics and class and a lot of other things is very infused with this. He's obviously not right about everything, if nothing else, because he changes his mind a lot, you know, over the course of his life. So he, you know, actually shouldn't be right about everything, but, you know, even stuff that he didn't necessarily change his mind about. All right, I don't think he's right about everything. And then, and so what you ideally want to do, right, and I think this is the best of what was sometimes referred to as analytic Marxism at one point, is to, you know, treat him like any other historical philosopher, which is to say, okay, let's like try to figure out like what the arguments are and if they're convincing, and if some of them are convincing and others aren't, and, you know, what parts can be detached, you know, from the other parts. And that's actually often something I feel like in my discussions about this stuff with you and also with Doug, right? You know, that's often, you know, like I try to, but I often feel like it doesn't come detached enough because there are always two different things going at the same time, right? One is the what did Marx say about X discussion, and the other is, was Marx right about this, and if not, what should we think about X discussion? Right. And, you know, and I mean, I think if nothing else, you know, I mean, he's you know, one of the most insightful people who's ever lived. So you want to at least try to figure out the answer to the first question in case it sheds some light on the second question, but also, to circle back to what you said, if you treat the first one as dispositive of the second question, that, once you've figured out, what Marx said, you've got your marching orders, then you're, then you've sort of just given up, actually like thinking about this stuff or trying to figure it out.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's tons of problems with that. One of the things that a lot of Marxists don't like dealing with, I think, is that for some of the main points of Marxism, as opposed to what Marx thought, for example, the schemas of historical materialism are, what we actually think the phases of socialism are, if there even are phases. They're like a paragraph or a page in a corpus of like 5,000 pages, like, and then you have this interpretive tradition around this page. Furthermore, to complicate things even more, a lot of those pages specifically were suppressed, some by Marx himself. So you don't really know exactly what he was getting at. I mean, one of the big things in Marxism is trying to figure out when he's doing an immanent critique and when he's actually doing like a substantive separate critique.
Unpack what you mean by that, immanent critique.
Well, immanent critique means just assuming the categories of your opponents, and and this is a dialectical argumentation style going back to Hegel, going back to way before Hegel. I mean, it goes back to Aristotle, really. Where you try to draw out their categories and logics and see where it goes, to see if you even assume their basic framework, would it lead to what they're saying it would lead to. I mean, Das Kapital definitely starts that way. Capital Volume 1 is definitely that to Adam Smith. It gets a little bit more iffy on Volume 2 and Volume 3, even though, they're kind of a conceptual whole and they each deal with different elements of the capitalist production system. But like,
well, they're also both like unfinished when he dies, right? So
yeah, extremely, and edited together by Engels. Although some people try to use that edited by Engels thing as a get out of jail free card.
Yeah, anything they don't like is Engels.
Yeah, and Fred Mosley and to some degree Mikhail Heinrich have gone through and pointed out. No, a lot of that stuff there are edits, but like a lot of that stuff is there. I think the biggest edit that you can find that you can actually blame on Engels is Engels cutting out some equations in Capital Volume 3 that may or may not actually cause problems just on the basic math. And I've seen different mathematical regression models and what problems they caused. And I'm not even just talking about the quote unquote transformation problem, which I actually don't think is as big of a problem as a lot of people do. I mean, like whether or not the numbers actually, even using accounting math, work out the way that we could empirically verify.
Yeah. So the issue that you're getting into here, right? Since I want to make sure people are clear, because I think I've probably like, I mean, I'm not bragging here. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing, right? But like but I've probably spent more time trying to figure some of this stuff out than a lot of people have. But and even like, some of this stuff, that like gets into the sort of nitty gritty of the mathematical economics. Like I'm not super confident, on my grasp of, So this transformation problem is like a problem that like a lot of mainstream economists have historically thought was a big problem for Marx's labor theory of value, which, although I also mentioned G.A. Cohen earlier, like one of the things one of the arguments that I really like in Cohen is some of the stuff where he's trying to break down, okay, what are the Marxist claims that you actually need the labor theory of value for, and what's the stuff that like maybe if you combine it with the labor theory of value, it's like an appealing package, but like could actually make a case for it independently. And that's made me feel much better about being sure to make some of this stuff like the transformation problem, or like there's people really want to like nerd out about this. There's something I know Doug is really into, which is the temporal single system interpretation of the labor theory of value, which
versus
is,
the static single system version interpretation of the labor theory of value versus the dual systems interpretation of the labor theory of value. Oh my God! Like, yeah. And there's two forms of TSSI too, and they hate and the people who propose them hate each other. So it's fun.
Right. So definitely not going to try to do that one on YouTube. But you mentioned earlier the something that I think might like really surprise a lot of people who haven't necessarily done like a super deep dive on this stuff, which is, look, if you only know one thing about Karl Marx, it's most likely going to be some version of, Karl Marx was a critic of capitalism and an advocate of socialism. And so if that's the one thing you know, and you know that, as you said, the man wrote like, 5,000 pages or something like that, then you'd think a bunch of those would be devoted to unpacking what he means by socialism and how it would work, or at the very least that somewhere in there, he'd pause and say, by the way, when I say socialism, I mean, and then give some like necessary and sufficient conditions. But no, there's absolutely nothing like that anywhere.
There's not that for a lot of things. Like if you actually look at class, like working class, there is an implicit definition in Capital tied to the circuit of commodities and the wage fund, but there is no explicit axiomatically stated definition of even what working class is in Marx anywhere. I mean, so have fun with that. Like there is some in Engels, but if you read, for example, when Engels defines that out and like his initial, what becomes the basis for the Communist Manifesto is like Socialist Catechism or whatever. Communism, right? Yeah, the principles of communism and his catechism. Yeah. Like they actually clearly changed their mind on a couple of the elements that make the proletariat between that and the time that Marx is writing Capital by himself. And when you read the manifesto, it's actually not clear if Engels' definition is the one Marx is taking or is he's already substituted his own. And I don't mean to like make Marxism like seem like it's way harder than it is, but in some ways it really is, because these letters and pamphlets and stuff were parts of debates. Another favorite one is, that we can get tied up in forever, but there actually is good historical studies on it, is the Dictatorship of the Proletariat.
Right.
It's only mentioned 12 times in Marx. It's super important. And yet it is only mentioned in context of arguments with Blanquists in specific. So when Marx is actually arguing with a different faction of socialists who use that term, so it seems like he's trying to wrest that term away from their definition. And then like the rest of the time, he doesn't really bring it up. Like it's not a big deal for him. There's actually like a 10-year gap or something between when he uses the term.
Yeah. So actually I want to get into both of those things, the dictatorship of the proletariat and more generally what Marx thinks about the state. Since now I know I haven't read the Hal Draper thing you referred to, but when people use this phrase like Marx's theory of the state, because it's not at all obvious to me that he has a theory of the state. It seems like he has pronouncements about the state, and they're kind of scattered and not always obvious how to put together. But I don't really know that there is much of a theory of it. But I think maybe on both that and the socialism question, it might like maybe one useful way to enter into it is to say, like, there's a certain picture that you get from sort of orthodox kind of like. Certainly, if you learned your Marxism from Trotskyists or probably other kinds of Leninists, that goes something like this, right? That okay, so anarchists are these people who want to smash the existing state and they don't want to replace it with anything. Marxists, on the other hand, right, want to replace it with, and then the idea is that when Marx uses this phrase, the dictatorship of the proletariat, which there's a whole analogy there to Roman history that we can get into, but when he uses this phrase, the dictatorship of the proletariat, there's this whole tradition by later Marxists of using that equivalently to something called a worker state, and which is, which seems to have been what the Bolsheviks thought that they were creating after the Russian Revolution, and even the sort of later Soviet Union, when it bore very little resemblance to any anything that Marx or even Lenin says about a dictatorship of the proletariat. There's still this tradition for those kinds of Marxists of saying that that's still a kind of worker state,
Right.
and then a worker state is supposed to be transitional between capitalism and socialism. Oftentimes, what transitional is meant, even in this interpretive tradition we're talking about, is not totally clear, right? Once you start asking obvious questions like, okay, so do we mean something that's like where capitalism still exists, but we're on our way to socialism? Do we mean like socialism already exists, but just barely? Do we mean something that's not anymore capitalism, but isn't yet socialism? I think that people who talk this way, I think they mean the third one, but I also think they don't clarify very much. And then the socialism that you're supposed to get on the other end of that, whatever else it means, right, is supposed to be a society that isn't divided into classes, and also that by this point there's something's happened called the withering away of the state, which means that we don't even have a worker state anymore. We have, I guess, something that would be like anarcho-communists might think of as their end. And also, to confuse things, there's this tradition that derives from a book that you've already mentioned a couple times, or really a very short pamphlet called The Critique of the Gotha Program, where Marx talks about, or maybe is wrongly interpreted as talking about, who knows, two phases of social. Well, really, what the word he uses is just communism for both of them. Two phases of communism,
Right.
And then there's this tradition, I think it's from Lenin, of using socialism to refer to the first phase and communism to refer to the second phase. I don't think Marx actually does that anywhere. And then whatever else that distinction is supposed to be about, communism is where you get to this phrase that everybody remembers from Marx. Although I believe I read that it actually comes from Blanqui, which is from Marx is lifting it from him, which is from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs.
Yeah.
And what that means is a whole different thing, right? But and then if you learned your Marxism from left communists, what you got at the very least, right? There might be other big differences too, but one big difference is that rather than just talking about socialism as a classless society or even as a classless, stateless society, there's this big emphasis on the idea that you no longer have something called the value form or the commodity form, which very roughly you can think of as you don't have markets, people paying for things with money.
Right. Although I'm not. This is actually one of the things that I find very interesting about that line, that focusing on markets as a primary way that it's a problem, because markets are not in and of themselves the defining, let's say, necessary and sufficient condition of capitalism. They are necessary, but they are found in not all but most societies. So you can't say that they are necessary and sufficient for capitalism because we find them in other societies. So focusing on that as where the value form is instigated, to me, has always been weird. Like, I've actually always thought it's in the wage relation, because that is unique.
Right.
So
yeah, certainly capital. Yeah, right. Certainly something that seems to, whether or not you think it's definitional, right? Like, this is something that I think, I actually, when I first started doing all this stuff, did a debate with this kind of eccentric Catholic right winger who calls himself the distributist, and something that he really made a big deal of, which I was this business about, okay, but come on, give me definitions of capitalism, give me definitions of socialism, and I kind of rolled my eyes at that at the time, partially because of his persona, but then I think the more I've thought about it since then, I think, oh no, actually that's like a totally it's a totally fair question, right? Like you should, because if what you mean by, like the sort of cheap answer is to say that what you mean by capitalism is, that's like a name for the phase of economic history that we're in right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then what you mean by socialism is, what we hope comes after it. But of course, there are, it's like one of these things. It's like last week I was talking about Daniel Bessner about fascism and this sort of debate about what counts as fascism. And so, all right, you have your historical exemplars, and then you have to decide like what's the distinctive thing about these that makes it fascism. And you can ask the same questions about capitalism, right? There are probably lots of things, right, that differentiate, the kinds of economies that exist now from feudalism or like ancient slave economies or other things. But but I think the question is like, all right, what are the most important ones? Or even like, as much as this is not a very Marxy way to put it, right? Like the question might even be like a normative one. Like what's the like, all right, like what's the feature that we're objecting to, right? When we use this word capitalism. And I think that there are certainly breadcrumbs to well, actually, I think a couple different possible answers to that question in Marx. But because that your answer to that is also going to tell you what we mean by socialism. But I think one interesting thing here is that not only does Marx say remarkably little about socialism, and again, there are these little fragments. Okay, there's going to be something called a dictatorship of the proletariat after the revolution. Then there are these phases of socialism. How are those things related? Is the dictatorship of the proletariat happening during the first one, or is even the first one at the end point of a transition to socialism called the dictatorship of the proletariat? But one starting point for all this is just to say that Marx actually like makes a couple of comments. Like most famously, I think there's in one of the introductions to Capital or one of the editions of it, where he kind of makes fun of I think Lassallean, I don't know, like one of the other factions of he name checks one of the other factions of socialism at the time, and I think it's Lassalleans, and says that these people are upset that I'm not writing recipes for the cook shops of the future. I guess they'd like Lassallean recipes, and it's. I have some ideas about why it is. Maybe like assuming that's not just an evasion. I don't think it is, right? I suspect that he actually has like some like deeper reasons for not wanting to go there. But what's your read on why he doesn't want to write recipes for the cook shops of the future? Why he's reluctant to like be prescriptive about what socialism would be like?
Well, I think part of it is that he rightly observes that, for example, if you look at the theorist of what we would call liberal modernity, and I'm going to say that as opposed to bourgeois for a second, because when they were coming up with what would become bourgeois society, yes, they were largely, declasse aristocrats and merchants, but their goal was not what we would call capitalism. It was not thought out in that way. And while Marx does think that what makes the proletariat unique, and this is also not proven in Marx. This is logically asserted. I say logically asserted, like because it's not out of nowhere. He doesn't just assert it, but it's not. He doesn't actually prove the argument. That because of the mode of production and the capitalism has created, because of the mass amounts of surplus, that when the proletariat seizes things, there will be an ability to do planning in ways that are different than the prior societies. So but because he still thinks it's limited to a mode of production, he's not willing, even in the when we talk about the critique of the birther program, it's the closest thing he does to actually sparing out. There's some other hints on like the nationalization of the land and the Civil War in France, hints on some things. But when you actually read that, there. I mean, you and I went back and forth, and we just the other day, and we were just like, both readings are valid from what we have here. Like, even when looking at the literally, it got down to, I was arguing with you about the grammar of the like conjunctions at the beginning of sentences in German, like to figure out if Marx is being, if he's spelling it out, or if he's being sarcastic, or if he's doing this like, because Marx was also given to trolling, frankly.
By the way, did you watch the young Karl Marx movie a couple years ago?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they captured that pretty well in there. The sort of joyful troll aspect, but yeah. So in critique, I mean, I guess I would just briefly put my cards on the table, right? Like I think that, I suspect that part of it is part of his reluctance to spell it out is about how it is like a sort of deeply democratic thing, right? That this is something that like people in the historical situation in the future, that I guess maybe he thought, pretty near future at some points, right? But who are going to be dealing with, with things that we can't just like predict from our armchairs, are going to have to figure out, and that there's something like a little bit silly about like trying to figure, like I mean look, I mean I'm working on a book about this, with Bhaskar Sankara and Mike Beggs, cheekily entitled The Blueprint, which is of course exactly what Marx didn't want to do. But like also I think that there's a certain way of I think so. I obviously think there's some value to doing that, but I also like there's certainly like I can see thinking that this is just a ridiculous exercise, right? Because it's like, oh, what, like after the revolution, the sort of like masses of workers trying to like figure all this stuff out, and that how they go, oh man, we really want to figure, really want to see like what Ben and Bhaskar thought about this, right? Like that'll give us all the answers. And I mean, the value I see in doing it is, or part of the value at least, is that I think you need to, even if it's only offered as a possible model, I think that it is good to have possible models to convince people that it's not just an entirely unrealistic aspiration, which I think I think most people, frankly, and regardless of their other political sympathies, regardless of their class position, I think most people have an understandable fear of wild leaps into the unknown. But I think that might be part of what's going on. I think that might be part of what's going on with Marx. I think there's also probably part that I don't quite get. But Critique of the Gotha program, you started to talk about, is interesting because that's the one place where he does lay his cards on the table in any kind of detail at all, right? Like usually you'll just sort of get these like sort of phrases or sentences, where he'll talk about, some political goal, which it's at least easy to read what he's describing as his political goal is like synonymous with socialism for him, although see above, who knows, right?
Right.
Where he'll talk about, cooperative ownership of the means of production, or, like a republic of labor, things like that. But in these few paragraphs, right, he's critiquing. So it's the Gotha program that he's critiquing is like the unity program for the founding of the German Social Democrats, and which I should say, by the way, is like one of the like probably the most important political organization in the history of socialism, in that like like Marx is writing one of his most important things to criticize the founding document. Lenin thinks for many years that it's this sort of model of what a workers' party should be. In fact, when he's supposedly devising his own idea of what a workers' party should be and what is to be done, he still explicitly says that the German Social Democrats are the model. And even when he breaks with Kautsky and he writes a pamphlet called The Proletariat Revolution of the Renegade Kautsky, he says in passing there that when it was good, that was that was the best, socialist party that we had. And then even later on, my favorite, historical deep cut about this, the ruling party of East Germany wasn't called the Communist Party. It was called the Socialist Unity Party because it was founded allegedly as a merger of the German, Communist Party in East Germany and the Eastern European part of the Social Democrats. And under those circumstances, I'm sure nobody had much choice in the matter. But also, I think it says something interesting about the kind of deep historical loyalty that the party inspired, that they felt the need to legitimize themselves by saying, oh, no, we're these guys too. So this is this incredibly important party in the history of socialism. And it comes together as like this unity congress, basically, of a faction, the Lassallean faction, and a faction that's more allied with Marx. And there's this unity program that's super Lassallean. And so this is his criticism of it, which, as you mentioned, was not published at the time because despite being kind of an asshole in many ways, Marx also was politically savvy enough that he didn't want to undermine his allies, at that moment. Right. But it was published, it was published posthumously, and it's not like we're, and it's important to say, like, this is something that was written to be circulated among like Congress delegates. So it's not like we're not doing the equivalent for Marx of like, Nietzsche's Nazi sister, like digging up some scraps of paper, that were like stuffed in his desk somewhere and, like stitching them together and reading, big things into them. This is stuff, this is something that was like a final draft that was written for circulation. But in there, he's criticizing a lot of different things about the Lassalleans, some of which have to do with the state and how we should think about that state. In fact, I think that's most of the focus as it goes on. But chapter 1, which is maybe the one that people are most likely to have heard of, if nothing else, that's where he repeats Blanque's phrase, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs, is the one where he's largely devoted to criticizing the Lassallean slogan that workers should equally get the full product of their labor. Which the fun thing about this is that I think if you ask most people who consider this to be Marxist, like, hey, identify as quote, workers deserve workers equally deserve the full product of their labor. Who do you think said that? I think most people who think of themselves Marxists would say, oh, Marx, right? Like that would be, because like an easy way to think of what he's saying about surplus value and exploitation is to say, look, it's unjust that anybody doesn't get the full product of their labor. So of course, everybody should get their full product of the labor. But he has this whole critique of this, and he's pretty savage about it. So he completely disassociates himself from that slogan. Sorry, Blanc. Somebody points out in the chat I mispronounce it. It's a good general rule of thumb that if you hear me use any word that like I don't call quesadillas quesadillas, but like that's about as good as I'm going to
I think they're telling you the origins of the phrase. It's in Louis Blanc and not.
Yes, okay, nope,
and not Blanqui.
All right.
Blanc is the person who coined the phrase socialist, actually, in France. So
okay, sure, capitalism, like okay, fair enough. So yes, I'm actually not just mangling words like I usually do. I'm also getting my my French radicals mixed up. So in any case, right? So what's your read on what why doesn't Marx like that slogan, and what is he saying that's different from the Lassalleans about the main subject of that to? Although interestingly enough, at the end of the chapter, he says this isn't the main thing we should worry about anyway.
Yeah,
which is like how economies should be planned or how goods should be distributed, to workers, post capitalism.
He just sort of actually just like, whatever, this is dumb. No, So no, my read on that is that he's attacking a bunch of notions at once. And Lassalle, Lassalle thought he was a Marxist, which is funny because how much of Marx's middle to late period of production is aimed explicitly at him. And oh my God, what he said in some private letters. But that said, he did cry at his funeral. And what Marx was worried about seems to be a couple of things. One, he thought that the idea of unalienated labor would mean that social reproduction wouldn't be possible. All right. So if we just get all our labor back, like just straight up directly after capitalism, because that's another thing that we have to deal with in this whole phase logic here, then how are we going to invest anything in building the structures for anyone else? I mean, that's the difference for Marx. And and there's some historical data to back this up. However you define capitalism, and like there's a 200-year window you can define capitalism in, I mean, to be frank, but as far as like where it started. But once you have it fully instantiated in England and starting to be how they structure both artisan production and agricultural production, it's the first time you see surpluses gathering above like 1 or 2%, and you have profits per se, and the way that we think of them now. And what I found interesting is I even have stuff that back this up from like, it's very hard to know if you're comparing apples to apples with historical numbers here, but there are people who've done studies in like the late English economy who are not Marxist who kind of back this up. If you read, who's that Keynesian guy who wrote this massive tome? Is it Wealth and Capital or Piketty? Piketty actually.
Capital in the 21st century.
Capital in the 21st century. That Piketty actually illustrates that too, that you just did not have massive surplus production before what the period that we would call capitalism. Marx is afraid that you don't do that, but he's also being very, very careful about, like, you and I were debating. I'm like, you said, well, he has taxes, and I'm like, but he's not calling them taxes for a reason, and the reason is he doesn't want any. Interestingly enough, given the way we know about what we can call communist teleologies of the state, to use a very broad and confusing term, but that Marx was afraid in putting too many of the functions of society into the direct hands of the state explicitly, and that's most of what Critique of the Gotha Program actually ends up being about. So when he talks about like you need deductions from the labor to fund schooling, to fund the building of factories, to fund this, that, and the other, but he doesn't want to call it taxes because he doesn't want to grant the Lassallean view of the state any legitimacy.
So whatever sort of organization, just to back up, make sure everybody's clear on this, right? So one of Marx's objections to this idea that workers under socialism get the full product of their labor, one of them you mentioned, right, which is that, hold on, what happens when the factory machinery starts to break down and needs to be replaced, or what happened, or is all technological industrial development going to grind to a halt? If not, right, like then we need people not to receive the full product of their labor, so we can spend, so we can use some of those. I'm really trying not to use the word value here, but we use some of those resources on like repairing old factories and building new ones and stuff like that. Another one of his objections is that you have like different things that are common needs, like schools and hospitals. Another one of his objections is that some people can't work, because they're disabled or whatever, and presumably you don't want to let them like just starve or like beg from people who do. So all of which, in a certain sense, and in fact, I think one of his objections is that, although it's not exact, I don't know how this fits into the larger argument is a whole other thing. But one of the other things he brings up in this discussion is that there's a certain sense in which, if you're concerned about fairness, it's actually not fair to reward people according to their labor, because because some people have different either physical or mental abilities or endurance or whatever that other people don't have through no fault of their own. So not everybody can make the same, labor contributions. And everything I've just said so far sounds like something that like Rawls would say if he were criticizing, that slogan. But one important difference is the one that you just pointed out, right? Which is that, if he wanted to say taxes, he would have said taxes, right? He says deductions. Which at least presumably signals that like whatever sort of democratic collective is managing the distribution of goods from the common store, and deciding what goes toward industrial development and what goes towards building a hospital and what goes back to individual workers and how much each individual worker gets. Whatever sort of thing we're talking about that does all that is going to be something that in some significant sense is unlike a state, is like not a state, or at least at the very least very different from the kind of states that we know.
Right. So one of the things you'll notice is not listed in that is a standing army.
Right.
Another thing is, well, Marx does seem to have concerns about what we would call law and order. I mean, look at his almost paranoid list of things he includes in the lumpen proletariat and the Brumaire. I mean, some of that's even I find slightly ridiculous. So, but he does care about like rampant, rampant theft, extraction, all that being a problem. But he doesn't seem to mention standing police either.
Yeah.
And I think this is because Marx has a different definition of the state from Lassalle. Lassalle thought the state was a creature of law, and he thought law preceded class. In fact, he seems to maybe thought law preceded like everything, because he's also a chartalist in economics. He's influenced by the German economist Knapp, who was which we might call state theory of value, which is that currency, all currency, even if it doesn't seem like it's fiat, is actually fiat and is a product of law. And Lassalle thought this was completely compatible with Marxism, at least off of reading Capital Volume 1, which would have been what was available at the time. And Marx was afraid of that. Marx was also afraid of some of Lassalle's instincts. For example, Lassalle was trying to backdoor make deals with Bismarck and the consolidation of Germany to like fight against the bourgeoisie by having the aristocratic forces buoy up the working class, which Marx correctly predicted would be a disaster, because as soon as they did that, they would suppress the working class themselves to keep their production high. So that's the context of these debates, some of which are not explicit in the Critique of the Gotha program itself. You actually just have to know the history of formations of the SPD, Marxist frustrations with the First International's collapse after its failing, because that's the other thing we have to take into account, because the other thing in the background is his argument with French anarchists, and particularly German and Russian anarchists, and Bakunin in specific, who were part of the International. It's called for the immediate abolition of the state, which Marx thought would be disastrous, because you would need a lot of those functions, and if you just abolish it all, I mean, yes, he does think you have to crush the capitalist state, but if you abolish all those functions immediately, then most people have, their way of life has been based on knowing these reproductions, like this social reproduction cycle which we live in now. And if you just completely abolish it all at once, he's afraid basically you're taking away people's understanding to adjust and survive. And what's really interesting to me, for example, the Reform or Revolution debates from the early 20th century, is that Marx clearly thought that they were both necessary, that it wasn't really an either or proposition.
Yeah, I want to get into that, by the way, just to lower the tone for a second, since you mentioned Bakunin. This is a good, and you also mentioned earlier that Marx could be a pretty entertaining hater. This is as good an excuse as any to read my favorite quote from a letter from Marx to Engels, written in Manchester in 1863, and I quote: "Bakunin has become a monster, a huge mass of flesh and fat, and is barely capable of walking anymore. To crown it all, he is sexually perverse and jealous of the 17-year-old Polish girl who married him in Siberia because of his martyrdom. He is presently in Sweden, where he is hatching revolution, in quotation marks, with the Finns. So Marx, whatever else you want to say about that, like Marx would have been like a really entertaining friend, not somebody who'd, not somebody you'd necessarily want to say as an enemy, but yeah. So I think the Reform and Revolution stuff does tie into this in an interesting way, because and this also really complicates the dictatorship of the proletariat thing, and also maybe the critique of Lassallean ideas about the state in the later chapters, the critique of the Gotha program, because what, as far as I can tell, right, like he means by the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? This implied analogy to the Roman Republic, where like it's normally certainly wasn't anything like democracy, really, in any sense, right? But they did have there were but it was as Republic, they had all these elaborate procedures to stop any one individual from having king-like power. So there were generally two, so there were like two consuls at a time who could overrule each other's acts. There were things that only the Senate could do. There were a bunch of different assemblies and tribunes and things like that. But this was good like in normal times, but every once in a while there'd be like a slave revolt, or or like one of the wars they were constantly in was getting really bad, or one thing or another would happen. And so as a matter of like a state of a state of emergency, right, this state of exception, the Senate would temporarily authorize one person to actually exercise those king-like powers, without somebody else to cancel them out, but it would be a temporary thing. But then when you start talking about the dictatorship of an entire class, like the proletariat, that seems like something a little bit different. And my best read on that is that he's saying that normally, right, presumably in your socialist, end state, you'd want whatever sort of administrative thing that exists, see above, very unclear, to be equally representative of everybody, right? But like there is this transition period where in some sense the working class is like aggressively imposing its will on other classes, and I think, right, like this is a little bit more speculative, but I think that the way that to fit this in with all these other concepts, at least for understanding what Marx is saying, is that the dictatorship of the proletariat is transitional in the sense that a capitalist economy, still exists to some extent, or is in the process of being replaced with something else. And this is what happens, this is what happens during that process. And the culmination of it is socialism, which he sees as in some important sense, stateless. Like you said, the deductions aren't paying for a standing army; they're not paying for cops. So how before we get to before we get to all the things that could complicate that, like how different is that from what you think he means by that phrase?
Not a lot. I mean, the dictatorship of the proletariat I've always taken was a suspension of political rights during a period in which capitalist styles of organizations are not completely gone, meaning so if you give people who are engaging them political rights, they can use it to reinstate the capitalist system. It is a temporary suspension, and it is also not a suspension to a party or to an individual. It is a suspension to an entire class. So basically it's a hyper democratic within the class, and until you are in that class in some way, you do not have the same kinds of political rights. Now, there's still socialists who would be bothered by that. I mean, like, because it's not, that would not just be depending on how you would interpret it. So most Marxist-Leninists actually have taken a slightly broader interpretation of this, where it is just the capitalists excluded from the dictatorship of the proletariat, not adjacent classes such as peasants. or sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, depending on what time period we're talking about. So,
which is one thing, by the way, you do have to give Bakunin, because even though I think a lot of Bakunin's like criticisms of this stuff are like paranoid and crazy and bound up with his anti-Semitism, there's also some stuff that you could read, like a Marxist Internet Archive, where, like, I remember in particular something I was reading that's like Marx's notes on something Bakunin had written, where he was like making fun of Bakunin for saying that if the working class, took power while the, peasantry was still this huge part of society, or maybe even the majority, it would end up having to it would end up like really undemocratically and violently, repressing the peasantry. And Marx basically says, oh no, they won't do that. So, as far as the actual history of the Russian Revolution, I think to Bakunin there, but yeah, so I think so, right? I think that it's like, I think that like the sort of one reading is, oh, Marx is talking about a dictatorship in the modern sense, like the dictatorship of a particular political party or even an individual exercised through the machinery of a traditional state, which is certainly what 20th century figures who claim to be implementing a dictatorship of proletariat were doing. And I think that's flatly wrong for several reasons. But there's also a way that some Marxists, I definitely remember reading at various points, I don't even remember, probably like ISO pamphlets or something, people sort of reassuringly said, oh, he just means workers' democracy. Don't get flustered by that phrase, dictatorship of proletariat. It's like, yeah, that's probably going too far too, right? Like,
workers' democracy, but only workers can be involved in it. Like,
yeah. Okay, so then the part that's confusing about this, right? Because like people oftentimes, when they hear that, they know this phrase "dictatorship of the proletariat," and they also know that very famously in after the Paris Commune, which in 1871, when workers and National Guardsmen, elements of the middle classes take power in the city of Paris and implement this like really radically democratic form of local government, including transferring some abandoned factories to the workers, getting rid of the a lot of the traditional bureaucracy, making everything electable and recallable, etc. There are places where Marx and Engels seem to be suggesting that, hey, look, this is the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? Made real. And then after that, right, there's a introduction to like a new edition of the Communist Manifesto, where Marx and Engels say, hey, in the Communist Manifesto, we're talking about it as if workers are just taking over the state and using it to expropriate capitalists. But now because of the example of the commune, now we understand this isn't the procedure. Instead, workers can't simply lay hold of the existing machinery of the state and wield them for their own purposes. They have to smash it. And that's a phrase that, like, I think anybody who came out of a sort of, any kind of Leninist, tinged version of Marxism, anybody who got their Marxist education from there has like had that phrase burned into their head.
Right.
But then what makes this a little bit confusing and what gets into the reform and revolution stuff you're talking about is that around the same time as that epiphany, Marx and Engels keep making comments, not a lot of them, just a few of them scattered here and there, but like pretty explicitly about how, hey, in these countries in continental Europe that are, ruled by, kings and emperors, then we need violent revolution. But there's, but we can have a different kind of path to power in places like England or the United States, or sometimes they'll, add in one or two other examples, which suggests something like a peaceful, they use language that suggests some sort of much more peaceful transition, although they worry that if a socialist party took power electorally, they correctly worry, right? Like the 20th century certainly gives us examples of this, that this would lead to the capitalists responding to that the way that the American slave owners responded to the election of Lincoln. So they worry about that, but they still say that we can have this like kind of peaceful democratic transition to socialism using apparently existing state institutions. And I have some vague ideas about how you can combine these two claims into like a coherent picture, but I'm certainly not confident in them. Like, how do you see all this fitting together?
So there's a couple of things about that. One, if you actually, and now I'm going to get into manuscript histories, but one, if you actually look at some of the places often cited for Engels and Pacific, saying if you have universal suffrage in most of the developed nations, that would mean that the proletariat would come to power, because the proletariat is the majority of the population in these areas, particularly in England, quite possibly in Germany, France after the events of the Brumaire. By that point, the peasant class has largely begun to liquidate itself, actually, interestingly, either through the enclosure of the commons or through just immiseration, forcing them into the city. So there's a feeling that they could have done this democratically. However, Engels does say that even in these scenarios, there would still likely be insurrectionary elements to the assumption of the government to get rid of parts of the government that exist. And he also worries about civil war, immediately ensuing as capitalist response, or capital flight circling the individual country, so you couldn't stay there. Now, why I talk about manuscript histories is Kalski edited some of that out in the late 1890s, early 20th century, so that it made the SPD look a little bit less threatening, particularly as they were adopting a kind of strange reading of Hilferding's Monopoly and Finance Capital, where they began to assume, particularly, definitely after the Bolshevik split with them, but they began to assume that you could democratically take over not just the state but capital itself, because they thought that monopoly capital powers would centralize all of capital into like basically a few institutions, and because they were centralized institutions, the state could just take them and take all of it at once. Now this didn't really work out that well, as we know from the history of between World War I and World War II, but that was the idea. And so Marx and Engels, I think, I honestly think in some ways they're inconsistent. I know anarchists will throw anarchists, and I'm not even talking about, I'm talking about modern anarchists, will go through like Marx and Engels talking about the difference in socialization and nationalization, and then point out that Engels actually backtracks on it later on and then flips again later. And so sometimes you don't know if like this is strategic to what argument they're having with other socialists at any given time, or is there a fundamental idea about like the state in insurrection against itself that we don't understand because it was never articulated? And that's a pretty big deal. Like it
is, right? Like, and actually somebody in the chat has an interesting quote from a letter from Engels to Bernstein in 1884, where it says the victorious proletariat must first refashion the old bureaucratic, administratively centralized state power before it can use it for its own purposes, which they say, there's a response comment here, which is refashion. The options were reform or a revolution. What the fuck is this, Engels? Which is kind of the thing, right? Because it's like if there is a way to make all this consistent, right? Like it's got to be, there has to be some like not completely obvious way of combining this. And I think also when you start thinking about what actually happened with the Paris Commune, or even for that matter, the Russian Revolution, there's also like an interesting question about like, okay, but no, really, what does it mean to smash a state, right? Like that's easy to say, but like, give me like a paragraph or two describing what that means without using the word smashing in it. And it's not, I think it's not that obvious, right? And this gets into like, and even like even like if you want to be a pedantic dick about it, like, like even like revolution, you can kind of do the same thing with it, right? Like, okay, the canonical example historically of a revolution is the French Revolution, but like, when did that happen? Like the traditional answer is
there's three different ones.
Yeah. And it's like, okay, well, hold on though, right? Like people say like, so the first of those three, right, is 1789, right? Like that's and then like the next one, right, is like the Jacobin coup, like a couple of years later. But that one I guess is a little bit easier. But that first one like is a little weird because you start thinking about it, it's like, okay, well, look, you call the Estates General, that's an institution within feudalism, and then there's this big fight about whether to have it be, whether to like how the like votes should be proportioned within this feudal institution. And after a lot of pressure, the king gives way. Is that a revolution? Right? Like that sounds in a way, more like a radical reform. Or then is it like one of the things the resulting, once the Estates General with the votes of proportion this way starts calling itself the, National Convention, and then they pass all these radical social changes. Is that the revolution?
As Thermidor the revolution, is Napoleon, which results from that, which actually, I mean, if you talk about consequences for Europe, Napoleon is more consequential than, I mean, unless you directly have Napoleon as a straight line back to 1789. I mean, there's in some ways it is almost impossible to see the clear semantic distinctions. I mean, one of the things interestingly, like the first debates you and I had against Doug, and we were actually weirdly on the same side because we're often not, was on this whole Hegelian critique of gradualism.
Yes. Yeah.
Which I said, yes, on one level, from a systemic way, yes, it's true. You do not have, things don't gradually change. They change punctuated and abruptly. But what gradualism is describing is just a bunch of those punctual and abrupt changes happening in time in a way that means that there's no precise moment where one thing fully becomes another thing. Like,
yeah. And even if you do think that there's a moment, I mean, my big problem with it is always that, like, I think the more you think about it, the less clear that is, like, what the upshot's supposed to be. Because if you actually look at the sort of examples, certainly that Engels is using in explaining this point in the Anti-Düring, then he's, they're all about things that are matters of degree. Right. And he's saying, okay, there's like a certain point where you escalate the degree to the point that you've made this qualitative change. And I think Doug's way of reading that, which, might be textually right, I mean, that's not really the part I'm most interested in, is that you have, like, there's a certain point, right, where you like add one more thing, right, where like that's where you've, it's like the tipping point, where you've made the qualitative change, so that you should be able to zero in on, here's the point where, like, I mean, here exactly how few hairs you have to have on your head to be bald. Now, of course, at the very least, right, whether you think it's just epistemic or it's something else, good luck saying where that is in any of these examples. But then also, even if you do think that there is some objectively right answer to where the tipping point is, even if it's really hard to know what it is, okay, I don't really see what the political anti-gradualist upshot of that is supposed to be. Well,
I mean, it leads to big misunderstandings, which Marx corrected during his life. I mean, his arguments with the French Marxist section of the French Socialist, which Marx, he was castigating his son-in-law, even, like, and that's where the famous "I am not a Marxist" phrase comes from. Right. But what he was talking about in specific was like, hey, don't propose these reforms to prompt the proletariat to revolt when they fail. Which, by the way, I've even seen people like read Trotskyist transitional programs as that, which I'm like, whoa, man. So that it would prompt a revolution, because one, why are you assuming that if you do that they're going to trust you?
Yeah.
And two, that's not really how this works. And but I mean, to be fair though,
Yeah.
he doesn't go back and say how exactly it works. He just says, don't do that.
Yeah. I mean, this is certainly a standard way of explaining the Trotskyist transitional thing, that you mobilize around these demands the system is not going to be able to accommodate. So then people realize that they have to destroy the system in order to make it happen, which is like arguably something that might work in some incredibly specific historical circumstances, but it's also weird to just sort of put this forward as like this is just generally how you should go around doing things, even when you're like on the fringes of society, and it's not like you're putting this, I think to try to be charitable about it, right? I think like probably the strongest historical example would be the Russian Revolution, where the transitional demands are incredibly simple. Land, peace, bread. That these are things that you can't, that you can't actually accomplish without overthrowing the provisional government and putting all power in the hands of the Soviets. And as simple as they are in that context. And so maybe like the Bolsheviks talking a lot about land, peace, and bread could like get people to do that. Although also, that just seems so different from just like some small socialist group like spending all of its time like enunciating these so-called transitional demands, and yeah, I mean, like it also seems like if there's some sort of protracted process of workers finding out that the things you're talking about are unachievable, then I mean, just psychologically, there's something incredibly weird about the idea that people are going to say, oh, well, that thing that you were talking about before, it turns out was impossible. So now we're going to go in even harder with you on
right.
this much more transformative thing.
I mean, if anything, what it seems to do, I mean, if you look at the actual German history, is it seems to demobilize the class you're trying to mobilize if there are other adjacent classes that are not necessarily part of the capitalist class. I mean, like if you look at the history of fascism, for example, or they were part of the capitalist class, sort of. Like the coalition that really made up the strong base of fascists were what we would call the working poor, as opposed to the unemployed poor or the laborers. And on top of that, they were mostly what Marxists would call petit bourgeois, small business owners who they may not have employed anyone, but they did own their own capital, or they were even like small farmers and stuff who probably did employ like one or two people, but were also pretty much living off of tenant arrangements and stuff related to feudalism that have been maintained during the Bismarckian period. And like the socialists got blindsided by them. I mean, just like they didn't even see them as a factor. So I bring that up because if you talk about like they didn't like this whole impossibilist demand thing, reform, like you don't need to deliver on reforms, is if you are doing that and demobilizing your class base. And there's two things they did in the case of Germany. There's that attitude. There was also the attitude of, like I said, of like building up capital, so that we can monopolize and seized. And that actually led, for example, sometimes the SPD to side with the capitalists and not the unions in Germany in the early in the teens, in a way that alienated their base. Plus, they didn't have any way to reach. They really weren't focusing on reaching out to the unemployed, who were more likely to become full-on communist. And both the communists and the socialists came up with justifications of how their internal enmity made a united front against the fascist or the conservative liberals impossible. So these kinds of logics and practice, I mean, you don't even have to game theoretic it out. You can see how it's gonna like blow up in your face pretty easily. So but a lot of times I admit, and maybe this will make me unpopular, when we read Marx, it does seem like Marx and Engels are trying to have it both ways on some of these problems.
Right.
And so you have to recontextually and think like, okay, what is the thing that's most consistent with both what they had priorly said and the debates they're having at the time? Right. Because they're also changing their minds. Like this idea that you have like Marx from age 20, when he was like, got out of trying to get his dissertation and like the Hegelian reading of Epicurus, to Marx at age 70, when like he's not writing that much anymore because he's like working out on weird mathematical manuscripts and trying to figure out labor tokens and traveling and doing, I mean, he is doing a lot of journalism actually. What like, do you think he held the same position the entire time? And it's clearly no. But you can also make too much of that. I mean, like one of the traditions that I sort of can't stand, even though the actual thinker Louis Althusser was actually somewhat honest and backtracking on his original claims through the course of his life, but he was like, "There's an epistemic break." I'm just like, "Good luck finding it." And the more Marx he read throughout his life, because originally when he made that claim, he'd read like 9 things by Marx. He'd completed Capital, and that was kind of like, in the Manifesto and like some of the German ideological manuscripts was like, oh, there's a hard epistemological break from Hegelianism to this weird form of materialism that no one knew about, and I'm taking from Spinoza and putting, and you just see throughout Althusser's life, you see Althusser retracting, like, okay, no, it wasn't here. Okay, no, this shows up here. Okay, no. So he wasn't entirely intellectually dishonest. Weirdly, his followers don't read him historically either. So they like read the early, more radical texts and then like throw that on to some modern theory now. And I hate when you do that, because what it doesn't seem like is Marx is not necessarily that consistent. And even in small ways, like, so when we talk about historical materialism, right? Engels uses the term, and you really get that from Anti-Doring, and you get that from Dialectics of Nature, which has its own set of controversies. But when you really look at the place where he spells out what he thinks Marx's theory is, it's in a paragraph in the, I believe it's the 1888, like 3rd edition of the Manifesto. And then you look at where Marx spells it out in Capital Volume 1, which again, it's a paragraph. And they actually have different mechanisms. So for Marx, it's the mode of production, and for Engels, it's class struggle. And these may or may not be the same thing, because class struggle is in the relation of production. I mean, like, people who've gone through either Hegelian Marxism or G.A. Cohen. Uh-oh, we're frozen. Ah, I'm alone. I'm now talking about the history of Diamat by myself. I can answer questions since Ben's not here. I just took over his show. I just appropriated his show. Mode of production undergirds class struggle, or does the class struggle undergird the mode of production? Like, so it's actually, to me, it's actually an interesting question, because Marx both puts them in the base, and again, the base superstructure metaphor is really confusing. But which one dominates which? They're actually kind of an interdependent feedback loop. There are a lot of, for example, a lot of people who critique G.A. Cohen talk about how he ignores the interdeterminate relations between class struggle and the relations of production and the mode itself. And sometimes, man, I can tell you, this seems like such a dry, pedantic argument that's basically about semantics, because what we're actually talking about is, interest in relationality and how you use materials within relationships, right? And these are emergent from those categories. Varn, if you could lecture on one historical figure, who would it be? Probably. Man, I don't know. If I was going to do a lecture on one historical figure, who would it be? It would probably be understanding early Mao. Believe it or not, I'm not. I'm not a Marxist-Leninist or a Maoist, but some of the shifts in policy and in philosophy that you see out of Mao between his early period in the Communist Party in the 30s up through when they become a head of state is sort of wild and illustrative. I don't say that because I think like there's a clear corpus there. Yeah, I am not Ben's son. Ben and I are the same age. Waiting for Ben to come back. Ben is cast into the void. Let's see other interesting questions. I would throw these up, but I don't have control of the live stream, so I'm just going to waste time while he comes back. Material base sets the conditions and pushes the change. The conditions does the work of the change. Okay, guys, let's talk about reification errors. All right. What is a reification error? A reification error is when you take a metaphor and give it agency and force. So are we talking about what the metaphor is describing pushing the change, or are we talking about the base pushing the change in the superstructure? Remember, models are metaphors, all right? Like, I know this is unpopular amongst Marxist thinking, but that's the way language works. Now, what are we talking about when we talk about the base of society? The base of society are, one, the natural wealth. Marx talks about natural wealth. The social relations that utilize that natural wealth, then valorize it because by itself it just exists, and the emergent structures which divide labor, lead to power hierarchies, etc. Coming from that, which is where you get classes, right? So that's the base, so to speak. But that base, even right there, we already see symbolic mediation. So, come on. Yeah, I haven't finished the George Lichtenheim book, but actually, let me grab it for you. So, Jeremy, it's right here. And I am approximately, let's see, Russian Socialism, 1840 to 1880. And Ben's back. Okay.
Hey, so I mentioned before we started streaming that I'm back in Jennifer and I are back in Michigan now, and
did your power go out?
Yeah. So we're experiencing this is a phrase that Southerners, or at least the one I'm married to, tend to be very amused by. But we're experiencing a wintry mix of snow and rain and maybe some hail. And the power went out for a minute, so I had to restart my computer. But I caught a little bit of what you were saying on my phone when I went out. But the timing was actually kind of beautiful because we're talking about epistemic breaks, and then I was gone.
You broke.
Yes, and then I broke. Let's just do. There are obviously. There are obviously like a lot more, like places that we could take this stuff. But since we should probably wrap up in a few minutes anyway, let's let me just. And I'm happy, of course, to if anybody has any questions they want us to get to in the last few minutes, stick them in the chat. Since the value form has not yet been overcome, super chats go to the front of the line, but I guess while we are, while we were waiting for that, right? Like I think that that we kind of covered, the reform and revolution question. Certainly not in the sense of resolving it, but in the sense of giving people some beginning of a taste of of why it might not be as obvious as it sounds, and some guys. I grew up in Michigan. Trust me, I've shoveled plenty of snow, and we've done a little bit of the what is socialism question, which I was sort of expecting that we'd be getting much more into, but I'm reluctant to try to start a deep dive into that in the last few minutes of the broadcast. So I think that an interesting place to maybe take it, while we looks like we maybe got a couple of actually, there are a couple of interesting questions there, so maybe we can go straight into them, or maybe just in a minute. But
okay.
But first, I guess, when we were talking about the state theory part, right? Like, I think you were talking about the deduction class, taxes question, and some reasons to think that what Marx is describing is not a state, or at least not the sort of state that we're familiar with. Actually, like, state is another one of those words that it's easy to feel like you know what it means until you start thinking about it. But but certainly, you mentioned a couple of, like, because it's very easy to say, and I think it's somewhat true, right? It's true to a large extent that, like, the function of a state is to prop up a certain set of economic relations, to defend property, and that's what a state is. Which, by the way, the more you emphasize that, the easier it is to explain what you mean by a stateless society, because if you get classlessness, you get statelessness on the cheap. Like, if a state is definitionally an institution of class rule and you don't have any classes, then whatever you've got must not be a state. But I think that is maybe a little bit too cheap, because it does also feel like we're talking about some much more concrete things, right? So you mentioned that a couple of the things that are not on Marx's list of deductions are soldiers and gendarmes, right? So I think this is worth thinking about, because there's like a maybe kind of simple-minded, like, objection somebody could have to it, but that I'm sympathetic to a point, right? Which is to say, like, okay, that is a big part of what states do, right? Is they defend property, they prop up a set of economic relations, but come on, it's not the only thing they do by any means. And surely at least some of the things that they do would be done by whatever this organization in charge of distribution is, this collective democratic administrative thing, like the sort of classic anti-libertarian thing, who will build the roads? Well, this would, right? And also, though, like, if we don't have the gendarmes, then we don't have cops, then like, there are worries about that have nothing to do with property, right? Like, I think if you go around and tell most people who aren't convinced Marxists or anarchists that we want a world that just doesn't have those things, they're going to have a lot of questions having to do with things like rape and murder and domestic violence. And I think I have, and I think it has to be conceded that most people who talk about having a world without these things are painfully vague in their answers to those questions, right? Like, so I mean, at this point, we've gone beyond the Marx exegesis, because Marx just doesn't talk about this. But like, but I mean, certainly one concern that I would have, and I'll just throw out there, and you can do whatever you want with it, is that if we don't have things like, some sort of professionalized institution for enforcing, whether you even want to call them laws, right? Whatever the rules are, and fairly clearly defined rules, and then a procedure for punishing people who break them, that like involves things that will look a lot like courts, etc. if you don't have a lot of those, like my first worry about this is going to be, and maybe this is just me being a squishy bourgeois liberal, but my first worry about this is going to be, well, hold on. Like when people tell me things like, oh, we'll have like a federation of local communes, then, I think, well, wait a second. What happens to like the rights of criminal defendants if you have a federation of local communes, right? Like, is there enough of a centralized institution that like, if everybody in my local commune thinks I did it, I can get a venue change?
It really depends on what we have to conceive of, I think, and Marx doesn't deal with this. Marx doesn't deal with legal theory very much. I mean, partly because Marx doesn't deal with the state. When according to Hal Draper, anyway, from the Diaries of Karl Marx, Marx initially set out to do an entire survey of the bourgeois society, which was going to cover all of this, and he got to capital and never got out. Like, that's where we stopped. We didn't get to any of the other elements of bourgeois society. Sufficiently to say that, like, maybe other elements of bourgeois society are not just, even though Marx's primary concern is we were arguing about the base earlier, but the base of economic production, because it is how you valorize material things, but in another way, you can't not deal with these things. However, our notion of like modern police and a standing army are actually very recent notions. Right. And in fact, in Marxist times, they would have been more uncommon than common. The United States was constantly fighting about whether or not it should have a standing army. It was considered a problem from people who studied the Roman Republic, because the standing armies were not loyal to the state or to the collective. They were loyal to specific generals, which became, a recipe for perpetual civil war. Right. There was, and furthermore, like modern police, as we think of cops, were an occupational force explicitly, coming out of Ireland. Then they were transitioned, former slaveholders in the South, union breakers in the North, and the Long Depression, particularly, is when you see development of like proper municipal, as we think of now with ranks and all that. It comes explicitly out of a military form. But that makes you think that there was no like officers of the peace before then, and there clearly was. You've heard of the Sheriff of Nottingham, right? Like Nottingham. Right. There's a reason why sheriff, was elected by local wards and later on elected by municipalities, and in many places they were also, to be a deputy was something that everybody served in. I think Marx has something like that. Like everybody would go through the training of being able to serve in those capacities. But you do have some issues where you have to have some kind of institution or a series of institutions to deal with, like jurisdiction claims, nationality claims. I think the answer that Marxists have traditionally had was the internationals. All right. But the internationals would have to have us, like, in some ways we have to ask, it's a similar question to asking, were medieval kingdoms states in the same way that like capitalist states are? In one sense, no. In another sense, duh. Yes. Right. And I think in some degrees, when you're looking at like the collective organization, even of a confederation of communes, if that confederation of commune has enough, representative force of the of confederated law to impose anything back down, it is effectively analogous to a state, even if you don't have a standing army, even if you like. So, I think you could call this Marxist post-statecraft, or maybe fleshing out a Marxist theory of state, but that hasn't been done. It's been mostly left to liberals, and then other forms of left thinkers such as neo-chartalists, who are mostly concerned about money, but they do actually have some ideas about law. Anarchists are actually better on this question. They actually do have more fleshed out theories of the state than we do, even if most of them are, even if most anarchists in practice ignore them. Like there are some anthropological theories of the state. Interestingly, this was also something that Engels was obsessed with, on the same logics and from the same kind of anthropological point of view. Like, how did this how did these things that are clearly merit and kinship relations become abstractified like this? I don't know that there's an answer out of it. I think the idea is you do have to look at the current state as having a teleological form for protection of property. That is what it was originally oriented for. But there have been all these things that have accumulated into the state in the last 150 years that were not really part of it when the time that Marx was writing about it. Like public schooling were super rare. His only example of it is like municipalities in the United States. And it's only municipalities. It's not even at the federal level.
Which actually, if I'm remembering right, in Critique of the Gotha program, he points to that as a model that we shouldn't have this like top-down state schools that LaSalle seems to want to have. We should have like locally controlled schools like they have in the United States.
Yeah, he says locally controlled schools, but he does grant that like social provisioning to allow who can and cannot teach is valid. And I guess that would also imply that like some kind of provision for curricular control. And again, so you have this like, okay, so what if the locality decides it wants to teach some batshit crazy thing? Yeah. Do we allow it because it's ostensibly democratic, even though it's not at the interest of even the people in the locality? Marx doesn't answer these questions. These are not questions you can answer with Marxism. I'm like, these are questions you have to answer, to me, with other forms of critical theory, legal critical theory, historical genealogy of the state, structural functional explanations. And I use structural functional together to separate from both functionalists who are conservative sociologists and structuralists who are notarians. So that people know what I'm talking about. So just like how are these functions going to go? I mean, even someone like Douglas Lane thinks when Marxists say, well, we'll just fix everything once we get rid of capitalism, Doug thinks that's not. I mean, even Doug thinks that's just silly. Like,
yeah,
like
I mean,
there'll be.
Yeah. Yeah, no, right. And actually I should also say, like, I think one of the things where I think one of my deviations, from classical Marxism, or at least one big strand of it, is that I'm not like, there's this sort of tradition of talking about, okay, well, once we get rid of class society, we won't have like the rule of people over people anymore. We'll just have this like administration of things. And like, that seems just obviously wrong to me, because there are tons of possible sources of social and political conflict that have nothing to do with class divisions, right? You could have a completely classless society where you still have different sectional interests. You could have like it just seems like you could have ideological differences that have nothing to do with it, right? Like I would assume that drug abuse would be a thing that would exist in a socialist society, if nothing else. Economic misery is often the cause of it, but there are plenty of people, who aren't experiencing economic misery who have severe drug problems. And so I don't know why you wouldn't have conflicts within a socialist society between more libertarian and more paternalistic, approaches to drug abuse. And even when you talk about stuff like I was talking about this with our mutual friend Lee Phillips, and he had a nice example. It was just like, well, actually, so he had two examples, one of which is kind of fun and one of which is much more mundane. So the fun one was, it's easy to imagine like an advanced communist society being bitterly politically divided about whether to colonize space or to spend those resources at home. And then the more mundane example was, look, like, just like the town wants to like run some sort of cable like under your like dwelling place, and you don't want it there because it's going to like cause some sort of disruption for you. So you have to have some sort of, fight about it in like the, on the planning board or whatever. Whoever wins, right, the other side just has to live with that. That really sounds like some people ruling over other people, in the sense that you have, divisions over what's going to happen, where various people's, interests are impacted. And the losing side, presumably has to submit to the will of the majority. Or
in some cases, the will of the planners. I mean, even some Marxist cases, like you think about Bordiga's organic centralism, there is the will of the majority doesn't even matter. It's like the brain of society, which is the party, which I guess is somewhat representative, like internationally, which Bordiga was crucial on. But like, yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of answers to this that seem very unpalatable. I mean, conversely, I personally also find like the Paracon answer, even when the Paracons are Marxist, to be somewhat unpalatable. I do not want to be into meetings where also the planning meeting brittleness is super hard, because you make a decision about every allocation in all of society once a year. Your feedback mechanism is if it works or not. If there's an externality, I don't know, like COVID-19 or pandemic, or something that, yes, capitalism or our mode of production can exacerbate or make a lot worse, but you can't separate out from that. But
which does get into like the thing that we've avoided doing a deep dive on, in the last, because like, I don't think there's a way to do this in 5 minutes, but but like if you think about the sort of thing I'm always arguing about Doug about like how to think about like what's like the goal of socialism and how important is it to get rid of, to like completely decommodify everything, to not have anything be mediated, by this, by the, commodity form. I think that if you're going to start to explain like, okay, why is that something we should care about? Like, why is this an important thing that like we should be really concerned about? And I think some of the most plausible, there are lots of different ways to answer that question, but I think one of the more plausible answers is, well, if we have things like organized through like commodity in exchange, then like there's an important part of our social life that is dictated not even by capitalists but by market forces that aren't under anybody's control. So like we want to bring like all aspects of our economic life together under conscious, deliberative human control. And Paracon, for better or for worse, I mean, has the virtue of being like the most intricately worked out explanation of what that could possibly look like. But then also, one of the things that you realize when you intricately work it out is that shit, if we bring everything under conscious, deliberative human control, then you don't get to enjoy your life. You just like it's just a eternal series of committee meetings, which, as somebody who, I haven't had a lot of jobs like this because, I mean, I've due to the academic impact of the of the meltdown of the world economy around the time that I was getting my PhD, and also some stuff that was my fault, like I sort of gone from gigs as an adjunct to like one or two temporary things, but like I did do a few years where I was like had to regularly go to faculty meetings, and those were like 2 hours once in a while, and they still made me want to kill myself. And so like I think about having to having the sort of eternal faculty meeting conception of socialism,
eternal faculty meeting plus eternal election year, but for everything in your life forever.
Yeah, awesome. Last question before we have to wrap up, which I do want to make sure we wrap before 7 for a couple of reasons, one of which is that I told Jennifer that I'd be available to eat at 7, and the other of which is that for people who are watching this, of whom I'm sure there are several who watch TMBS, Matt and David are going to make a big announcement tonight, so you should check that out. You should tune in for that. So I don't want to step on that, but I thought, so let's just pick what I thought was the most interesting question I see in the chat, which is Luke asks, is there anything socialists might learn from studying human nature? Can we build an evolutionary cognitive science of socialism?
Yes.
All right. Very good. That's very succinct.
I'm actually fascinated with an anarchist thinker who's obsessed with this very question about incorporating. I'm a little bit hesitant to say human nature. What I'm going to say is biological innatity to hominid species, because it gets me out of a whole lot of like stupid philosophical debates I don't want to have. But yes, I think you can. And one of the things I think we have to do, for example, another thing we talk about ideological preference, let's just be honest, there's temperamental preferences. Some of us would be temperamentally conservative in the sense that we might be cautious or aggressive, even under non-scarcity constraints. We have evidence that this exists, in hominid species, even in like hunter-gatherer societies, and stuff like that. So I don't think that's going to go away. The other thing is, my hope, while it's not as radical as like Doug Lanes, who literally thinks we could gamify everything and have a giant computer simulation run communism.
Right.
And like, yes, you think I'm being unfair, but no, that is his answer. That I think something like information inputs need to be in there, but you need it in a cybernetic system that can handle these various information inputs and adjust production accordingly, of which something like currency would still be part. So now, whether or not you think currency is money in the way that Marxists do is a completely different question, and one that I could spend years debating with MMTers and different kinds of Marxists about. But you do need some kind of information feedback loop. Otherwise, we're going to be in direct committee meetings forever. And like, if you think election year suck now, just imagine that for the rest of your life about what kind of toothpaste you're going to make. Like that's, and you do need human nature inputs. And by the way, I know Marx is often accused of being the anti-human nature leftism the most. All right. Marx thought that species being was a thing. He just thought it was always mediated by your historical circumstances, which I think if you talk about heritability and expression, as opposed to like, genetic, human nature is just genetically this and people don't change. People clearly change. We're fairly plastic, but there are certain things that we innately believe. Marx was actually kind of onto that. He just said you can't study it in people because you don't ever encounter people anywhere in history unmediated by some social form, but you can see where these things come out. So yes, I totally think we can have, and I'm not even talking about like incorporating like shitty Evo psych. I'm just basic understandings of like human brain functions and stuff that like Marx couldn't have dealt with, and Marxists have been trying to incorporate for a long time. I mean, that's why all that psychoanalytic Marxist stuff came about. That is what that is, like an attempt at, because Marx doesn't, in addition to all the other things that we've said, he doesn't state his theory of mind.
Right.
People assume it from a historical materialism that individuals are totally mediated by their economic production standards, but there's stuff in early Marx and in late Marx that cut against that, both the writings on species being and stuff he talks about like individuals versus aggregates. Like he does realize there's a difference, like history is made in aggregate, but individuals can kind of go wherever they want. That's why you can have proletarianizing individuals, both economically, but also in their interests, are people who decide, just make the decision. Like, I'm going to be with this class because I think it's more moral to do so. Marx does not think that's impossible in the individual. He thinks it's impossible in the aggregate. Like,
yeah. I mean, I think he explicitly said in the Communist Manifesto that you're going to get individuals from the bourgeoisie. You're going to side with the proletariat. It's also like, I mean, if he had thought that was impossible, or generally if he thought like a lot of, like some people like get really into this stuff, they think that like being like a sufficiently hardcore materialist means thinking that like nobody ever just like changes their mind, like because just like that nobody ever changes their mind for any sort of non-material reason, which I've always thought like, okay, if that's what being a really super duper hardcore materialist means, then why would anybody be a super duper hardcore materialist? Because obviously wrong. You can think that in a sort of aggregate way, on average, big groups, that there's certain kinds of mass persuasion where the heavy lifting has to be done by changes in material circumstances and developments in class struggle. But like also clearly people change their minds all the time, right, for other reasons. And in particular, it would have been a bizarre performative contradiction for Marx, since he spent his entire life, right, like arguing with people. Like that's what he did. He argued with people. That's the whole of his output. That if he didn't if he didn't think that arguing with people ever got anybody, ever persuaded anybody of anything, the whole thing would be a very strange.
Yeah. Also, Marx and Engels weren't of the class that they were writing about. Like,
right.
I don't know. Like, Marx was declassé, and Engels was like a manager whose parents were bourgeois. So,
totally. Like if Marx had a theory that entailed the non-existence of Engels, that would be embarrassing. Okay. I still want to try to do the hard out at 7, but if you can do the lightning round version, our friend Jean Bajalan says in chat, I want Varn's opinion on Rojava.
Oh God. Lightning round version. It's complicated. Oh, man. I tend to support. I tend to think that Kurdish autonomy is worth supporting, but I have skepticism about how romantically it is presented by anarchist liberals and even some Marxists. And I also think that impulse may have been abused by imperialist forces in the U.S. fighting, frankly, other forces who were acting imperialistically in the region. I mean, so you're in like national. It's like Serbia, right? Like, yes, the Serbian independence movement was probably justifiable, but also in the context of the inter-imperial powers of World War I led to all kinds of bad shit. And so that's kind of my opinion on Rojava. I do think there are promising things coming out of there, but I'm also hesitant to say, like, I'm hesitant to like completely paint it as a rosy picture or like it just uncritically good. Just like I'm hesitant to like stand for Assad or crap either. The ethnic tensions and the class tensions of the region, from having lived in Egypt, I know were way more complicated than they are normally presented to Westerners and even the left-wing media.
All right, fair enough. I think that's pretty good for a 1-minute answer. So we will 100% for sure do this again in the future and maybe pick up some of the threads that got short shrift today. But this was a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
It's fun. Thanks, man. Have a good night. Enjoy your dinner.
You too.